Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are going to be looking, this time not at the Kisvei Rambam, the writings of the Rambam, but sticking more authentically to the theme of the show, Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. We're going to be looking at something that was put into the actual Shuvos of the Rambam. It's not the question of whether standing for the Ten Commandments, and it's not some of those more well, you'll tell us in a moment, Rabbi Fried. This is an iconic one. It probably should be an iconic one, which is whether someone can and should give a bris milah, circumcision, to a Christian or to a Muslim. Now, why would they even ask a Jew for one? You'll give us all the background momentarily. But first, some background on our esteemed guest, Rabbi David Fried. Rabbi Fried has received a BA Mathematics from Brandeis University and an MS in Applied Mathematics from Stony Brook University, which makes a lot of sense, I realize, because you also hail from the highly esteemed Jewish community of Plainview, New York. For those listening who don't get why I say it's highly esteemed, my in-laws are from there, my intern there, and Rabbi Fried is from there. Now, Rabbi Fried is currently serving as a Judaic studies instructor at Ramaz and has previously taught at the Frankel Jewish Academy in West Bloomfield, Michigan. Not Michigan. What is it?
Frankel Jewish Academy is West Bloomfield, Michigan. Yeah.
Oh, it is Michigan. Okay. I thought I didn't know my Rosh Tavis for MI. And the New England Jewish Academy in West Hartford, Connecticut. Connecticut, I recognize a little bit better. And he has also published on numerous topics from Talmud to Tanakh and Halacha and Jewish philosophy, and is an editor, of course, at the Lehr House, where I have benefited from his erudition and expertise on editing several of my own pieces. And perhaps one of his most prestigious accolades is that he was already a guest on our friend Rabbi Drew Kaplan's Jewish drinking show. So now you can add this as yet another feather in your hat. Rabbi Fried, it is wonderful to have you with us. And why don't you start off by telling us a little bit more about the Shaila the Rambam is dealing with and any background we should know in general about his Chuvos and the particular scenario in front of us today.
So the question, right, as you said, is, can I give a milah? Can I circumcise a Muslim or Christian child, or a non-Jew more broadly? But the Rambam, of course, is living in a place where the non-Jews around him were predominantly Muslim. There might have been a few Christians, and right, the questioner asks, is there any difference between Muslims and Christians? Which, sort of the background to that, why might I think there is a difference, is that the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah says that basically all of the Arabs today are obligated in bris milah, quoting the Gemara that Bnei Keturah, the descendants of Abraham's third wife, are chayev in bris milah, and since Bnei Keturah and Bnei Yisrael are all mixed up today, so all of the Arabs, he says, are obligated in bris milah misafek. So I might have thought that, okay, I can circumcise the Arab Muslims because they're obligated, but maybe I shouldn't do it for a Christian, right? And the questioner himself recognizes that this is going to depend on how you interpret a certain Gemara, where the Gemara says, it's in Avodah Zarah, Daf Chaf Vav Bet, Tana Rabban Yisrael Malet Hagoy L'Shem Ger. So we have a brisa that says a Jew can circumcise a non-Jew for the sake of conversion, and then adds the line La Fuke Mishu Morona Dilo, excluding what you're not allowed to circumcise a non-Jew for the sake of Morana. I'm not exactly sure what their medical terminology, but some kind of infection on the foreskin that you would want to remove. For that purpose, the Gemara understands that you are not allowed to circumcise a non-Jew, and the questioner wants to know what is the Rambam's, interpretation of this Gemara and general view on circumcising non-Jews.
That's interesting. So the implication of the Gemara, which I would have thought the opposite, but obviously Chazal knows better than I do, is that it wouldn't be a big deal if you're circumcising Goy because it's for medical purposes. It's not for a ritual. We're not mixing up religions. But here it's saying is no, if you're doing it specifically for religious purposes, then it is permissible and authorized by Judaism, which we wouldn't say the same thing for something like Shabbos, for instance, which we know is exclusively for the Jews. And we're not supposed to be encouraging non-Jews to keep Shabbos, to put it mildly.
Right. So that gets to the question. And there are Rishonim who, I don't remember off the top of my head, but certainly Achronim who disagree with the way you just read that Gemara and think that, right, there is an Isser to circumcise non-Jews. As we'll see in a moment, the Rambam does not hold that way. That there is an Isser to circumcise non-Jews, and Morana was not Dafka. It was just an example of anything other than L'Shem Gerus, and precisely for the reason you just said, that Mila represents this special brit between the Jews and Hashem. And so just like Shabbos, we would say that really a non-Jew should not be doing Mila. And really there is some kind of Isser to circumcise non-Jews. And again, Morana was not Dafka. It was just an example of something that was not L'Shem Gerus.
Right. It was
Now,
just an example they gave. Now, I'm curious, before we get to the Rambam's unique approach to this matter, I'm curious a little bit just about the nature of the tshuva. Who's he writing it for? Is this one of those that's not even originally in Hebrew? I'm trying to get a little bit of an understanding of the context. Was this something happening frequently at his time that required an entire tshuva, that non-Jews were approaching their Jewish neighbors and going to the Moel and asking them to circumcise them? What was going on in his day that prompted this tshuva? I assume it's not just for academic purposes.
Yeah, it sounds like it was being asked by a Moel who actually, wanted to circumcise the, non-Jewish babies. Again, we know that Muslims did and to this day do circumcision. I don't know to what extent Christians in those days did circumcision, although the questioner asks about it as well. I have heard cases even today of Muslims having Jewish Moel circumcise their children. I don't know how common it is. I don't know how common it was then, but I guess it happened at least once because there was a questioner asking about it. As you alluded to, right, this is part of the vast majority of the Rambam's tshuvot that were written originally in Arabic. That was the vernacular language where he lived in Egypt. And, so most of his questions were coming from people in his own community or in the broader Arabic Jewish community. And so most of his questions were Arabic. He did occasionally get questions from outside of the Arabic speaking world. A bunch of questions that he got from the Jewish community in Provence, where their vernacular was French. The Rambam did not speak French, so he wrote those tshuvot in Hebrew. But the vast majority of the Rambam's tshuvot are in Arabic, and as such, until they were translated into Hebrew, were virtually unknown to the non-Arabic speaking Jewish world. And this is one of the reasons why I find this tshuva so fascinating, in that I'll mention briefly, there's a passage in the Mishnah Torah that the Rambam's going to allude to in his tshuva here, and there's a whole machloket achronim among Ashkenazi achronim, don't speak Arabic, how to interpret this passage in the Mishnah Torah, neither side of which is aware of the fact that the Rambam has already addressed this question himself in the tshuva.
Oh, wow. That would have been an important data point.
Yeah, that certainly would have been an important data point.
So this is fascinating because I understand that Rambam's main population spoke or understood Judeo-Arabic, though when I think of Shalos and Shuvos, I generally think of rabbis corresponding with rabbis. So I would almost think, if he's corresponding with rabbis, he would want to write it just in standard rabbinic Hebrew, which would be the language that, you would think that class would communicate in. Does this mean that when he writes in Judeo-Arabic, he wants the broader population to be reading these chuvos as well?
I mean, I think it's mostly he wants his questioner to be able to understand the answer.
Mm-hmm.
His questioners are not rabbis. They may
Interesting.
not be fluent in Hebrew. So he writes for them in the language they speak. It's not
Interesting.
clear. All right, it's not necessarily clear to me that he ever intended to publish these.
Wow. So how did we? I mean, this might be a little bit getting too much into the weeds, but I mean, when did we actually uncover the Chuvas Rambam? Do we have any idea of that?
I mean, I think they were known to the Arabic-speaking Jewish world for, you know, far back. They were the first collection to be translated and published in Hebrew. I forget the name of the edition, but it was in the 1930s, 34, I think, but I could be off by a year or two. And then in the 40s, a slightly expanded edition, the Blau edition, was published, which is the version that's on Bar Ilan, so it's the version that I use. I've compared the two translations for this tshuva, and they are not significantly different in any way.
Oh, okay.
As we'll see, even though it's published in the 1930s, 1940s, that doesn't mean everyone in the, Ashkenazi world is suddenly becomes familiar with it right away. It takes time to read through all of them. So we'll see, Rav Moshe, Rav Aaron Kotler are still writing about this passage in the Mishnah Torah, in the early 60s, seemingly unaware of this tshuva from the Rambam that was published in the 30s.
It's interesting because a lot of chuvas of the Rambam, I think, are brought to people's attention by way of other svarim. So, for instance, let's say in the sugya about listening to music nowadays. So, Rambam in his chuvos has an even more machmir position than he has in Mishnah Torah. And the way many people reference it, you look at secondary source literatures. Oh, and the Torah brings down the Rambam and his chuvos, and everyone's citing the Torah, but a lot of people aren't necessarily going straight to the original chuva of the Rambam. And I guess you're saying that's because it wasn't as widely accessible.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of times that's true. Like, before, the explosion of books being available now, like, what did people have? They had a Gemara, so they knew, the Rishonim on the page or in the back of the Gemara. And they had a Torah Beit Yosef, so they knew whatever the Beit Yosef quoted, and that was it.
Right. Fascinating. We take a lot for granted these days with all the accessibility we have. So this is good background, and that's what I like to do a little bit on the podcast, is not just simply go through the tshuva, but kind of understand a little bit of the behind the scenes. So I appreciate that. So let's get back to the tshuva itself. So we have a question in front of us. For one reason or another, or it depends on the reasoning, a Christian or Muslim seeks to get a bris milah. So the Gemara says that when it's l'shem mitzvah for gerus, certainly it's part of the conversion process. But when it's not being done for conversion, that's where things become a little bit more ambiguous. So what's the Rambam's approach to solving this question?
So again, before we get to the Rambam's approach in the tshuva, right, it's worth noting what he says about this in the Mishnah Torah, what the debate was about how to understand that passage in the Mishnah Torah, and then what the Rambam says.
All right.
Here.
So break it down for us.
So the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Milah Perek Gimel Halacha Zayin, he writes, Akum shetzarech lechatech or lachtoch or lato mipnei makao mipnei shchin shenolad bo haya aser Yisrael lachtoch ota. So he says, he starts out by saying that if a non-Jew wants to remove their foreskin because they have some kind of wound or some kind of shchin, some kind of boil on it, I guess that's how he interprets Morana from the Gemara, it's usher for the Yisrael to cut it off, cut off the foreskin. I'll get a little bit later into why. Talk about that in the tshuva also, but skipping ahead. Afal pisha nase mitzvah berefua zo hare lo nitkaven lemitzvah. Right, it says even though they're fulfilling a mitzvah by doing this refuah, by cutting off the shchin, but that wasn't their kavana. Lefikach im nitkaven ha'akum lemila muter liyisrael amuloto. If the intention of the non-Jew is for Milah, is for the mitzvah of Milah, it would be permitted. Now that would seem to settle it, except there's a huge machloket achronim. What does the Rambam mean? Imnit kaven ha'akum lamila. And it starts with the Kesef Mishnah, the earliest of, the achronim on the Rambam, Rav Yosef Karo, who also, even though he speaks Arabic, but also seemingly did not have this tshuva, where he writes, Im kivein lamila means to be a ger, right? To be a ger. And, skipping forward several hundred years, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva where his questioner is trying to prove that there is value to non-Jews doing mitzvot. And Rav Moshe kind of sort of meets him halfway. And he says, yeah, I mean, if it's the kind of mitzvah that, has inherent value, then sure, it's valuable for the non-Jew to do it. If it's the kind of mitzvah, though, that's only valuable because the Torah said so, then there's no value to a non-Jew doing it. And Rav Moshe puts Mila in that second category and says there's no way the Rambam meant that a non-Jew who wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Mila has any kind of excuse for fulfilling the mitzvah of Mila. And he says the Kesef Mishnah is right. All the Rambam meant here is that he, by mitzvah of Mila meaning l'shem gerus.
Okay.
On the flip side, also in the 20th century, Rav Aaron Kotler disagrees. And Rav Aaron Kotler says, absolutely not. Right? The Rambam said l'shem mitzvah. He didn't say l'shem gerus. The Rambam holds that, a non-Jew who wants to fulfill a mitzvah, there is value to that, even if it's not chayiv in it.
Right.
And as part of this, again, this back and forth between Rav Aaron Kotler and Rav Moshe on this, because Rav Aaron Kotler quotes this famous passage from the Rambam in the Perush Mishnayot, where the Rambam says that even though a non-Jew is not obligated to give trumos and maestros, if a non-Jew wants to fulfill a mitzvah anyway, there's still a value to that. It still has close for that. And that's where Moshe says, no, trumos and maestros is something that has like inherent value to it on its own. It's not that you can't learn from Mila to there.
Right. This sounds like it's part of that fundamental question of Eino Mitzuva Va'osa, doing a mitzvah you're volunteering. Now, generally, this comes up more when we're thinking about, let's say, a woman volunteering to do a mitzvah shesman grama, a time-bound mitzvah. And there's this fundamental question I recall in the Rishonim about why is it someone who volunteers to do a mitzvah gets less reward, less har, than someone obligated? You would think if I do something out of the goodness of my heart, God should give me more reward because I wasn't obligated. And one of the opinions in Rishonim there is because, well, if God didn't command you to do it, it means God doesn't want you to do it or doesn't at least care for you to do it. And I wonder if there's a similar dynamic here.
Yeah, I mean, right. Gadol mitzvah v'yosem mishenim mitzvah. This is a sugya in the Gemara, and there's different opinions why that's so. What's generally agreed on, though, is that even if the Eino mitzvah v'yoseh doesn't have as much zechus for it as the mitzvah v'yoseh, it's still a good thing. There is still zchus for it with certain exceptions that are, we won't get into now, but that, that in general there is zchus. But that's what Rav Moshe wants to say, right? You can only say there's zchus if there's intrinsic value to the action. There's no intrinsic value to Mila other than it being a sign of our, of our brit of the Jewish people's brit with Hashem, and therefore you can't put it in that category. And again, Rav Aaron Kotler says no. The Rambam, when he was talking about truma, didn't mean to limit it to truma. He says it about all mitzvot.
I think that's an important point that you make, which is certain mitzvos are specifically meant to distinguish the Jewish people from the other nations. So it would kind of defeat the purpose of a non-Jew practicing that if it's meant to, like imagine, we have the mitzvahs against chukas akum. So is a non-Jew supposed to keep those mitzvahs? Is there any idea that they should do? The certain mitzvahs are meant to distinguish us from the Goyim.
I mean, yes, like the Rambam thinks Chukas Akum is about Avodah Zarah,
Well,
and
right. So
therefore,
if it's about Avodah
since
Zarah,
non-Jews, Sheva Mitzvahs Noach are obligated to not worship Avodah
all
Zarah.
right,
Yes, they also should keep Chukas Akum, ideally not chayiv in it. It's not actual Avodah Zarah, but sure, keeping
yes.
them farther away from Avodah Zarah is great.
But what's interesting here is so just looking at the Tshuva of the Rambam, I glanced at it, of course, before we logged on. My understanding is that he says there is some inherent value, even separate from conversion. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, so he
What is it against
alludes
Ramosha?
to it. He alludes to it here, right? So part of Rav Moshe just took for granted that, of course, Mila is one of those mitzvot that's just a an arbitrary sign of the covenant, doesn't have intrinsic value. The Rambam alludes to the fact here that he does not view Mila that way. That he does view Mila as having intrinsic value, and if you were to open up the Moreh Nevuchim to where he, just goes through all the Tamei mitzvot and see what he says about Mila there, yes, it's quite clear that the Rambam believes that. So Rav Moshe's chiluk might still be right, just that he puts Mila on the wrong side of the chiluk. The Rambam there says that Mila has the value of it's assigned to help distance us from Gilei Arayos.
Mm-hmm.
And as
that's a good thing for non-Jews too.
Right, Gilei Arayos is one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach. So
yeah, distancing them from Avodah Zarah, from Gilei Arayos, they're all great ideas. Everyone would benefit from that.
Yeah, so the Rambam clearly sees Mila as something which has intrinsic value, and as he therefore says in this tshuva, right, siding with Rav Aaron Kotler against Rav Moshe, that yes, there is close to a non-Jew who wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Mila, and therefore no problem. Now,
so this is fascinating methodologically because, there's already discussion about when you have a stira, you have a contradiction between the Chuvas Rambam and Mishnah Torah. Okay, maybe we prefer the Mishnah Torah over the Chuvas of the Rambam. But here, when you have an ambiguity in what the intent of the Mishnah Torah was, and you have an explicit Shuva of the Rambam, we don't need all the, thumb dips and pilpulim to figure out, it makes her a great brisker shear. But here we actually have a Shuva of the Rambam telling us explicitly what he meant in the Mishnah Torah.
Yes, exactly. And this is, one of the reasons why I love the Chuvas of the Rambam so much. In that, yeah, sometimes it's gonna render Achronim wrong and I guess Rav Moshe would just have to be modeh, like the Rambam says itself, but it also shows you that the Rambam is thinking of the kinds of questions that we normally think of as Achronish questions. And you're learning Reb Chaim, and his, brisker Torahs, and all the times you wonder, is this really the way the Rambam thought? And the Chuvos have convinced me that yes, this is actually the way the Rambam thought. Now, again, that doesn't mean every Reb Chaim is shot in the Rambam. It doesn't mean the Rambam was using the words Chafetz and Gavra and everything. But the kinds of questions that Achronim ask on the Rambam was asking on himself.
Well, you could clear Hakir, if you will, and what the point of all these chidushim on the Rambam are. Is it for really understanding the authorial intent, or is the Mishnah Torah heichi timsa to a good brisker shear? So I had this Hakira
yes.
when deciding which section in the Beis Medrash to put the Rambam. Do you put it on the halacha shelves, or do you put it on the Achronim Lamdash Gemara shelves with all the chidushim there? And I think that's the nafkamina. How do you look at the Mishnah
Torah? I think a lot of times, Achronim sort of methodologically, for theological reasons, don't want to argue with Rishonim, although, as we all know, some Achronim do. So they'll write their chidushim in Rishonim, and they might not be shot in Rishonim, but actually they're pretty good shot in the Gemara.
Right. Oh, so they reframe Rishonim, borrow their authority in order so that their chidushim. Okay, I see what you're suggesting over there. So this is a fascinating point in the Rambam. I think another fascinating point that stuck out to me is we generally think of Rambam as kind of the go-to source, or the locus classicus, if you will, for distinguishing between Muslims and Christians. Now, he's not the only one, but when you think about, just to give an example, Chacham Ovadia Yosef's tshuva, saying you could go into a mosque but not into a church. So he points to the Rambam, and the Rambam saying that theologically Muslims believe in one God, Christians believe in the Trinity. And what's interesting here, or maybe just to give one other example, teaching non-Jews Torah. So actually, it's interesting. Rambam flips over there. Rambam actually says you could teach the Christians because they believe in the divine origin of what they would call the Old Testament. But Muslims don't even recognize the divinity of the quote Old Testament. So actually, there he's more makel on Christians, ironically. But in general, he sees Muslims as closer to Judaism theologically. Yet here he says that there's no distinction bein hayishmaeli v'hanotzri between the two of them.
Yeah. Right. You're right. A lot of times there's distinctions, which is, again, I'm sure that's why the questioner asked if there was a distinction, like knowing that the Rambam oftentimes does make distinctions like that. Here he doesn't. Here his whole point is there's no Isser, right? If a Christian read in their Old Testament and about bris milah, and they're like, hey, that sounds fun, I want to do that. Like, okay, great. Like there is no Isser, right? Which gets the next one. Like, what is the problem? What is the problem if it's, if they're not?
All right. Maybe it's not a mitzvah, but it should be a neutral action then.
Right. So what's the problem with doing it if it's just for the sake of some kind of medical purposes? And there he says the answer is it's lo techanim.
Ooh. That's not PC.
That is not PC. No.
Want to tell our listeners what that is?
The Gemara understands from the pasuk of lo techanim. There are 3 different ways that pasuk is understood in the Gemara, but one of them learns that lo techanim is from lashon chinam, that you're not allowed to give a matnat chinam, something for free, to, and this depends how you interpret it, let's say either a non-Jew or an Oved Avodah Zarah. The Rambam seems to interpret the latter, so let's go with that. That you can't give a free gift to an Oved Avodah Zarah, and therefore I can't just, perform medical services for them, and here's the key, for free. Right? If it's mishum lo techanim, as long as they're paying me for it, it's fine. And also, if they're a Muslim, it's probably fine for that reason because they're not an Oved Avodah Zarah.
I remember in the sugya about how you're not allowed to free an Evet Kanani, a non-Jewish servant. So the Rishonim, I think, get into the lumdus of what's the isser of doing that. And I think lo sechanim was one of the explanations, which explains why you'd be allowed to free them if you want to turn them into a full-fledged Jew and count them as number 10 for a minyan.
Yeah.
Because you're benefiting. Now you have
I just want to point out, the Rambam is a very good contextual read of the Gemara. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah is in the middle of the sugya on lo techanim.
That actually sheds a lot of light. He didn't just pull lo techanim out of nowhere. That's actually what the Gemara is discussing.
Right. In fact, if you look at Rashi on the Gemara, Rashi also says mishum lo techanim.
Wow. But this doesn't have really a lot of practical import because what doctor is not billing for their services?
Exactly. Right. So Rashi in 2 words or 3 words, mishum lo techanim, essentially says the same shot in the Gemara as Rambam does. Again, lots of others did not read the Gemara this way, but it's a very good contextual read of the Gemara. And it's also, and here I want to point out, the Rambam takes you through his limud of the Gemara in the Tshuva, and he says, what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says that, sorry, I don't want the Gemara so I quote it correctly.
We always like to get precision.
Yeah. All right. So the Gemara says, right, Yisrael Mala to Ovei Kochavim L'Shum Ger. So the Rambam points out, okay, so the Gemara could have stopped there. If the Gemara meant to say, I'm only allowed to circumcise a non-Jew for the sake of gerus, it should have said Yisrael Mar to Oved Kochavim L'Shum Ger. Full stop. The Gemara adds the next line, La'afuke L'Shum Marana Delo. Right? And he even he gets into what's the Gemara thinking? Why did the Gemara have to add that line? It says, well, Pshita, it's obvious I can do it l'shem gerus. Who else is going to do it l'shem gerus?
Mm-hmm.
So the Gemara clarified that actually I don't mean only l'shem gerus. Actually, it's dafka only that the exception.
Right. Now
And
what's
it had to add that line to tell me actually no, I don't mean the brisa as dafka that's the only case. I mean the exception as dafka, and because side reason lo techanim, but actually in general there's no isser to circumcise non-Jews, and it's the kind of like very close diuk in a Gemara that you'd expect to find in Tosfos. We don't,
hey, Rambam was no slouch either.
Right, we don't expect to find it in the Rambam because the Rambam wrote a halacha sefer. The Rambam didn't write a pirush on the Gemara, and that's always like part of the question that Achronim are trying to figure out. How did what was the Rambam's derech halimud in Gemaras? And again, I think you see from the Chuvos that the Rambam knew how to learn like a Tosfos. The Rambam knows how to make close to Yukim and Kler Chakiras and ask kashas on himself from other Gemaras. And, you see that a little bit less in this tshuva because this is the Arabic-speaking world. Actually, in his Hebrew tshuvas, you sometimes see that more because when he's speaking to a French audience that is familiar with Tosfot, he very much has to speak the language of Tosfot.
He has to prove his street cred to all the Bali Tosos.
Yeah.
So, okay, these are a lot of very important points. And this is, to our readers, I have the Machon Yerushalayim edition. This is Siman Kuf Yud 110. It appears as different numbers. I think it's 124 in the Blau, which you're using. I feel like I'm at like leading a service on Shabbos with the page announcements, open an art scroll here and the Koran on page 270. Yeah. So any other, because as we, when we learn Torah, time flies when we're having fun. We're approaching the last few minutes of our time together. Are there any other salient diukim points that you want us to know about the Rambam and you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I guess so. Let me two more points I'd like to raise. One is another reason this tshuva in particular is so fascinating to me is that the Rambam comes to exactly the place I'd expect the Rambam to be philosophically. We quoted the Moreh Nevuchim earlier. This, universal value of mitzvot is something I would very much philosophically expect from the Rambam. And yet he clearly doesn't just force his philosophy into the Gemara as, some of his opponents would accuse him of doing, right? He gives a very close and compelling read of the Gemara to get to his point. And he takes texts very seriously, even as he comes to a conclusion that I totally would have expected from him philosophically.
But he's faithful to the text.
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
The other, I think, salient point to mention, which this also from Rav Aaron Kotler's piece on it, but I think it just gives you another insight into the Rambam's thinking, that Rav Aaron Kotler points out that the Rambam holds that a circumcised non-Jew still has a din of an arel, or whatever halachos that entail, right? If he then decides to convert, he has to do hatavas dam brit. And so for Rav Moshe, like that was the proof that obviously he doesn't think you can do Mila for a non-Jew for something other than Gerus because the Rambam holds you're still an Arel. What's the point? And Rav Aaron Kotler says, well, no, you have to make a chiluk between getting schuz for the Maisa Mila and the shame mahul on the Gavra.
That's what I was waiting for. Some good lumdus here.
Right. And again, it's a very, Aaron Kotler's not from Brisk, but it's a very Brisker type chiluk. And again, it's the kind of chiluk that it makes you wonder, did Rishonim actually make that kind of chiluk? Can we really split between the Maisa Mila and the Gavra Hamahul? And again, the Ram doesn't say it explicitly in the tshuva here, but it has to be because of the way he comes down, that he says so forcefully that yes, there is chus for a non-Jew wants to fulfill the mitzvah, and at the same time, right? He obviously he hasn't indicated changing his mind from what he says about in the Mishnah Torah about them still being an RL. Like, so it seems clear to me that yes, the Rambam is in his head making those kinds of, what we call a Harnish Chilukim.
Wow. So here we go. Rabbi Fried, you're on the record now defending the yeshiva establishment for the Brisker method. Usually because I feel like if I may, in like the Lair House world, sometimes we're like, oh, those Briskers, they're just trying to have fun. They're not actually faithful to the Rambam. And you're like, no, actually, sometimes the Brisker Hakirs actually are the most faithful interpretation. And I think something that I learned a lot from you today is the importance of course, we study Shulchan Aruch. Of course, we learn the Rambam. Of course, we study the codes. But I think, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, this is why it's so important to look at the originals and to look at the shalos and tshuvos that are generally being codified in these codes that we study, because many times if we actually look at the original text, it may reveal something that we wouldn't know just by looking at a halacha in the Mishnah Torah or a sif in the Shulchan Aruch. So Rabbi Fried, I really appreciate you bringing this close reading of the Rambam to my attention, to our listeners' attention, and Hashem should just give you continued hatzlacha to be editing, to being mechadish your own Torah. And I encourage all of our listeners to follow all of the wonderful Harbatzas Torah that Rabbi David Fried is doing, both in his official and in his voluntary capacities as well. Thank you so much for your time today, Rabbi Fried.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Chris, for having me on. It's been a pleasure getting to talk about Chuvah Rambam with you.
Until next time.